Hello and welcome to the final piece of chapter 11, which is the end of the book. We've made it to the end. The section that we're covering is grace, and this is from the book Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, A Catholic Response. I'm Dr. Thibault, and this is an overview of this section. If you would like a copy of this book, you can use the link below in the description to get a copy. Digital, audio, hardcover, softcover, English, Spanish, however you want it. So the final step of this heuristic, right? We've looked at good counsel, and part of good counsel was listening to the medical advice. And then we said, well, we need to make a judgment, which is to restore the person to closest to nature as possible, the natural order. Next, we also need to make the judgment that we should use the least invasive means possible to achieve this. Step 4, apply the virtues. Live a virtuous life. It will lead to an easier ability to overcome whatever you're dealing with. So virtue is help. And then lastly, grace, right? Grace. And it all leads to the perfection, right? It leads from the sciences to the principles, to virtue, to grace, right? It's moving in that hierarchical order towards God, right? So sometimes I think evangelical sources or Christian sources, they make the mistake of only focusing on grace, right? This is not the Catholic approach, that the only approach is grace, right? We have to consider the natural sciences, and we have to do an application of virtue, right? And then it is perfected, right? It is the beginning and it's the end is grace. The section says, due to its fallen nature, the redemption of the body will not occur until the resurrection. Therefore, man depends upon God's grace and salvation for ultimate happiness, which is the goal, right? It's this idea of the new creation, that John Paul II talked about in the theology of the body. Right? We'll receive a perfected body in the sense of the imago Dei, right? The image of God. But this perfection is not fully for this world, right? It's for the next, right? Sometimes people focus too much on that, right? Well, none of this matters. It's just about the next. No, this life does matter, and it points us towards the next, right? The perfection is in the next. Now let's transition from mercy. So this is a little bit left over from the last section, still chapter 11, but the last section, but I cut it short in order to provide this transition. So moving from mercy to grace, right? So St. Augustine says, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, right? So part of our life, living in love with God, right, with charity, is still going to be incomplete in this life, right? It points us towards God. So for the transgender person in particular, but for all humans, there's just not going to be satisfaction. So this idea of dysphoria, dysmorphia, I don't feel complete, right? I don't feel whole, there's something missing. This is all part of the human condition. This isn't always something that's unique, right? Why does gender ideology spread? Because of this feeling of incompleteness, right? Even people without a medical disorder are engaging in this gender ideology because of the ultimate issue of being broken, right? A broken human. Rachel Ann Williams, who's a transgender activist, even she points out in her writings, my body is not enough for me. It just doesn't cut it, right? You see this in Kate Bornstein, you see this in Bryn Tannehill, you see this repeatedly over and over again when people sit down and write about their transgender experience, is that their body and their biology is not enough. They have a more expansive view of themselves, right? see that within people who claim to be non-binary or gender fluid or things like this. It's saying, I don't want to be defined narrowly, right? I'm more expansive than narrow boxes, right? So they're trying to fill it with something, right? There's an incompleteness about their feelings of the human condition, right? Blaise Pascal points out, more famously and earlier on, there was once in man true happiness, of which all that now remains is an empty print and a trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are. Those, though none can help, since the infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immeasurable object. In other words, God himself. Right? This is the idea of the God-shaped hole within our hearts. Right? Like a puzzle piece missing, that one piece that will complete us. This is the idea of Blaise Pascal. And we try to fill that God-shaped hole with everything we can. Right? It must be money. It must be pleasure. It must be honor. Right? It must be wealth. It must be, if I were a different gender or a different, if we had a different culture, right, or a different economic system. Right? If it were just communism, if it were just, free market capitalism, if it were just this will complete me. All a God-shaped hole, right? So our brokenness leads us to desire, right? It's just part of it. Moves from the human, right? The brokenness and the fragility and the vacuum within our hearts to the only thing that fills it is God. This moves us from human virtues to divine, right? The divine assistance, grace. So the Catechism defines grace as participation in the life of God. Right? We can get complicated about grace, but it's just participation in the life of God. Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council points out, since human freedom has been weakened by sin, it is only by the help of God's grace that people can properly orientate their actions towards God. Right? So feeling dysphoria, feeling broken, feeling incomplete, looking for answers. The only thing that will properly orientate ourselves towards happiness, right, is God. Right? This is the ultimate beginning and end. Right? Lastly, from the Gospel of St. Matthew, for human beings this is impossible, but for God all things are possible. Right? To live the good life, to live the virtuous life, to experience eternal happiness, all of this is impossible for us. It all requires grace. Also a sense of redemption, right? These are a lot of lines that are very similar to one another, right? The line from the Exultet, Father, how wonderful your care for us, how boundless your merciful love. To ransom a slave you gave away your son. O happy fault, O necessary sin of Adam, which gained for us, O so great a Redeemer. Or as St. Ambrose points out, my guilt became for me the cause of redemption, through which Christ came to me. Or very famously from St. Paul, I was given a thorn in the flesh. Right? I can read the whole quote. But what is the point of all three of these quotes? Well, we experience brokenness, we experience limitation, we experience the fall of Adam, right? We experience our own fall. What is the point of any of it? Why did God create a world where people have fallen, broken, incomplete, dysphoric? To turn to Christ, right? To turn to God, to realize you can't do it all on your own. You cannot save yourself, right? If in some ways life were perfect, right? We were all millionaires, we were all jet setting and comfortable, and well, this would be lovely, but would we ever turn to the most essential parts of our humanity, our limitedness, right, our finiteness, and say, God help me, right? We probably never would, right? It comes from our brokenness that we come to realize that, right? And dear, blessed are the poor, because they depend on God for every day, right? They're more likely to be blessed. Okay, another way of looking at grace is that we have habitual grace, we have sanctifying grace, we have actual grace. So sanctifying grace, right? This is the grace you need to be saved, right? This is applying to transgender people or non-transgender people equally. We all need grace for salvation, right? We're on equal footing on this regard. Habitual grace is a permanent disposition, right, which is a good one, right? Baptism or things like this, right? A permanent disposition. But then we have actual grace. Now, actual grace is specific types of grace given at the beginning of your conversion or in the course of your work of sanctification. It's what people need in their individual lives and their individual situations. Actual grace. Now, this God provides specifically for each of us. So a transgender person will experience actual grace differently than a non-transgender person. This isn't true of habitual grace or sanctifying grace. Under that, we're all human, right? There's an equality. But under actual grace, there's certain grace needed for people with specific challenges within their lives, right? So the prayer for actual grace would be important, right? And the openness to receive actual grace would be important. St. Augustine, when he writes about this, he says, indeed, we also work, but we are only collaborators with God who works. For his mercy has gone before us. It has gone before us so that we may be healed, and follows us so that at once we are healed, we may be given life. It goes before us so that we may be called. It follows us so that we may be glorified. It goes before us so that we may live devoutly, and it follows us so that we may always live with God. For without him, we can do nothing, right? So we are collaborators with God. We are collaborators with God's grace. But God is the beginning and the end of it, right? And he works with us throughout it, right? So no one can have this grace who has not been called, who has not received the grace, and nobody can be healed or glorified who has not also had this. So the question then, right, or the statement would be, are you open to receiving actual grace, right? Are you open to the grace of being healed? The participation, right? It's participation in grace, right? Grace is rooted in God's love for humanity and requires, this is according to St. Thomas, man to prepare his soul, since he does this by his free will, and yet he does not do this without the help of God, moving him and drawing him to himself, right? It's this complicated back and forth, right? You can't receive the actual grace without preparing a way through free will. However, you can't do it without God's help, and he's constantly calling and drawing you in deeper, right? But there needs to be a level of assent, right? You need to assent to the faith. You need to be open to it. You need to say yes, right? Amen to it. Jacques Maritain, when he writes about something like this with the preparation, I haven't quoted Jacques Maritain enough, so I decided to put him in here. The deepest layer of a human person's dignity consists in the property of resembling God, right? So what is the point? God became man so that man may become like God, right? Not in a general way, but after the manner of all creatures, but in the proper way. It is the image of God, right? It's the Imago Dei. Right? This is the thing that we are being drawn into. It's preparation for becoming the imago Dei, right? You can't just say, well, I am the image of God. No, we're in a becoming, right? Being drawn into this. Again, is this particular to transgender people? No, it's not particular. That part isn't particular, but it is a necessary piece of healing, right? Whatever the cause, whatever the direction, whatever you're going through with this, if you have the virtues and you have grace in your life, you do it more beautifully, more easily. It flows more naturally, right? There's a piece there. And towards the end of this section, I also throw in some Kierkegaard, right? Not that he's a Catholic, but I think sometimes what he wrote fits in just fine, right? I like Kierkegaard. He says he was writing a letter to a family member who was very sick, bedridden, chronically ill, and feeling kind of useless. He writes, when everything has been forgotten, it is inwardness that still matters, according to Kierkegaard. And he writes to his family member, he says, above all, do not forget your duty to love yourself. Very important, right? Do not permit the fact that you have been set apart from life in a way, been prevented from participating actively in it, and that you are superfluous in the obtuse eyes of a busy world. Above all, do not permit this to deprive you of your ideas, the idea of yourself, as if your life, if lived in inwardness, did not have as much meaning and worth as that of any other human being in the loving eyes of an all-wise governance, and considerably more than the busiest haste of busyness, busy in the wasting life and losing itself. Right? What is the suffering that Kierkegaard talking about? Right? Kind of this suffering unto death idea. The greatest loss is not loss of body. It's not physical illness. It's a loss of your soul, right? And what does illness do? What does brokenness do? It causes us to stop, reflect, turn inward, rely on the grace of God, participate in the virtues, focus on friendship, right? Stop being busiest, in the haste of busyness. I think this is important, right? This is important stuff, right? You're feeling dysphoric, you're feeling broken, you're feeling rejected. Turn to God, right? That's the Kierkegaardian answer, and it's fine. And lastly, in the conclusion of the conclusion, we point to this idea: what is the church's response to all this? What is our underlying goal with the transgender issue? And to quote a line from St. John Paul II, down in Mexico, right before he started teaching the theology of the body, he said, the truth that we now owe man, the truth that we owe man is first and foremost a truth about man, right? It is our job as the church to teach people how to be people, right? How to live a human life. Jean Vanier, right? Becoming human, right? You might presume we're all human, but right, we all have rational souls. We're all people in a sense, but to be truly people, there's an assenting, right? There's an assenting to the good. There's the freedom of excellence, right? That's the end goal, the freedom of excellence, eternity, everlasting life, abiding in God, and the enjoyment of God, right? These end goals, the ends, are possible, but we must learn how to be human, right? And this is a failure of our time, is that we have failed to understand how to be a human being. And that is our goal. This is why this is a theological matter and not just a medical matter, right? Some of this is learning how to be us, learning how to be ourselves, and not following the ideology. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed this review of all 11 chapters of the book. If you are following it as it's going, I still have not made the introduction yet. I wanted to wait on that. So there will still be one more video. It will be the first video. We'll have gone full circle. So if you're more interested in anything I have to say on these things, follow along on the virtues. I'm covering the Secunda Secundae of the Summa Theologica. You can listen to hundreds of hours of me talking about virtues, but I probably won't make much more on the transgender issue right now. Okay, so have a great rest of your day.